1975. A man stands alone in the bathroom of his high-rise apartment, shirtless, examining himself in the mirror. He touches his torso and feels something under his skin. Something tangible, something that shouldn't be there. A lump, and it's moving. Is it a cyst? An abscess? Or is it something else? Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the zombie movie, and we examine the work of visionary director David Cronenberg and explore the world of body horror.
That's disgusting.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across several weeks. We are currently in the middle of exploring the evolution of the zombie movie, and this is part 5, in which we take a little break from The Walking Dead to explore the world of David Cronenberg and body horror and its link to the evolution of the zombie movie. Now, this is your spoiler warning. We will be talking about David Cronenberg's first 2 feature films. That's Shivers from 1975 and Rabid from 1977. We'll be talking about both these movies in detail, including their endings. So let that be a warning to you. If you haven't seen these 2 classics of the genre, then go away and seek them out. Not only that, I've got a very special treat for you this week. I also got the chance to interview a member of the cast of David Cronenberg's Shivers. The brilliant Lynn Lowry, who played Nurse Forsyth in the movie, sat down and had a little chat to me about what it was like to make the film and what it was like to work with the legend that is David Cronenberg. So you will be hearing a little bit of my chat with Lynn later on in the episode. But loads of stuff to cover this week, so let's get started. Joining me to discuss all things David Cronenberg, one of my very favourite people to have on the podcast. She was here last series discussing the Blair Witch Project with me, and I am thrilled to have her back. She is the UK editor at Den of Geek. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Rosie Fletcher. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. How have you been?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Very well.
Good. Excellent. So this time round, obviously, we are talking about zombie movies. What are your thoughts on zombie movies? Are you a fan?
Well, so this is the thing. You asked me that question and my instinctive response is no, I don't really like zombie movies.
Yes.
But that's actually a massive lie. I do. It's just an interesting, so I wouldn't say that I seek out zombie movies as a subgenre.
Yeah.
Because obviously there are an awful lot of them and a lot of them tend to be a bit rubbish.
Yes.
And they tend to be the same. And I think while I massively like and support low budget filmmaking, I think they can be a temptation because zombie movies are quite easy, potentially, for there to be a lot of high volume of not that great ones. However, there are some absolutely brilliant. I was thinking about this on the way here. Zombie movies recently, like Train to Busan, for example, or like film? The TV shows, not as recent, but like The Returned and In the Flesh, which were both just absolutely phenomenal.
The Returned is it's that French TV show, isn't it? Really brilliant because it was a zombie thing, but it kind of snuck up on you as a zombie thing almost.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't obviously that at the beginning, and yeah, that was really interesting. What's In the Flesh? I don't know it.
So it was a BBC Three thing.
Oh, cool.
And it's absolutely brilliant and it's completely heartbreaking. I think there were 2 series. I only watched the first one because I don't know. But the first one was really amazing. It was 3 parts, and basically, so I think the thing about the zombie subgenre is that it is extremely versatile.
Yes.
So certainly historically it was about one thing.
Yeah.
But now it isn't. It really doesn't have to be about the same thing. So
totally.
In the Flesh, the sort of conceit of In the Flesh is that they've found a cure. Mm-hmm. And so people who had been zombified are now, who had died and come back. So I know there's lots of different kinds of zombies, but this is ones they had died and come back. But they're now cured. So they are basically it's about one boy who's being reintegrated into his own family and into his own society. And it's about how how that community responds to him.
What are you? He's a bit different looking, but he's still the same.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
We're living in a world where real monsters exist. They are not your neighbours, not your friends. They are imposters, changelings of the highest order.
And really the sort of themes of it were, I think that it's basically like what happens if you had like a psychotic break and committed a crime that you don't remember, and like how would that work, and how would you deal with that if you were the person who did something terrible but really doesn't remember doing it, and how would the community sort of accept you. But it's really beautiful, and the last episode is utterly heartbreaking when you find out how the guy died and what he actually did. Like tears, serious tears.
I might have to check this out. So
it's brilliant.
I wonder if it's
genuinely.
is it still out there on BBC, like iPlayer or anything like that?
You know what? I haven't checked.
No,
it might be.
I'll seek it out. It
Have
sounds
look,
really good.
It's really good. Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think it's like wading through all the zombie stuff to find the gems, isn't it? That's the thing. Like obviously, like I think you're right. It's probably a genre that filmmakers love to do because it's quite cheap and easy in a way. But also, there are always audiences for zombie movies. It feels like. Why do you think that is? Because if you look at some things like slashers, it feels like they kind of come and go in terms of their popularity. Whereas zombie movies, it feels like people always flock to see them. Why do you think we love zombie movies so much?
Oh, I don't know. I wonder if it's. I wonder if it is to do with the versatility, or it is this idea of. So I don't find zombies scary. No, personally.
No.
Because I feel like, well, you can hit them with a stick. So, as you know, as discussed on many podcasts ago, we talked about Ring, which I love and is the scariest film ever. You can't hit Sadako with a stick.
No.
But the thing about zombies, well, so, again, it's changed more recently, but traditionally is that it's about society, isn't it? So it's zombies en masse. Yes. So one zombie isn't a threat; it's everybody that is the threat. That it's this ever increasing vast mass of something coming at you. So it's almost the individual versus the society, and not getting subsumed into that, which is why it worked so well in like Dawn of the Dead, where we can talk about consumerism, where it worked in Night of the Living Dead. We talk about American civil rights. Like there are big themes that you can talk about within that, and so I can see why that would be an appeal. And I guess there's also a visceral quality to it, isn't it? The kind of eating the flesh.
Totally. And that's, I mean, which obviously we're going to get into big time this week with kind of body horror and that kind of thing. But there is I think something just, I guess, you're right. They're not scary, but they are, I guess, just more fun in some ways than other subgenres. People, at least that's probably the opinion of a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I think you could be right. And because I think for some people, like, you might not want to watch a home invasion movie because it's a bit too close to home. If you're somebody who lives by themselves, it's like, actually, I don't really need to be addressing this. Or sometimes, I mean, so some supernatural stuff freaks me out a bit.
And like, even Blair Witch, which we talked about last time, is scary and brilliant. I don't know how many times. I don't think I could watch it over and over again because it is quite scary and traumatic and disturbing in a way. And whereas, I guess Shaun of the Dead, for example, I've watched several times, so there is that kind of fun element. There's a kind of video gamey element of it as isn't there?
And we sort of understand the rules of it as well.
Yes, yeah.
So that once that shorthand already exists now, which in a way is really useful because then you don't have to, as a filmmaker or scriptwriter, like write a great big explanatory backstory. You don't need to establish the rules particularly because everybody understands that, which gives you a bit more space to kind of kick in early and ramp up the gore, basically.
Totally. So would you right now, do you think that I was talking to a few guests about this who have all kind of mentioned, like, are we getting a bit of zombie fatigue at the moment? Like, is there any life left in kind of zombie movies in terms of new, original, innovative ones? Do you think we're likely to see any more anytime soon, or have we done everything we can possibly do with zombie stories now?
No, I'm almost certain that it is one subgenre that definitely isn't going to die. Like, seriously, for the last, I don't know, 10 years, I've been like, oh my God, is the zombie movie going to die? And it isn't. And it keeps being regenerated and reinvented. And I know, like, for example, One Cut of the Dead, which isn't, but is, spoiler alert. But again, it was really funny and innovative. And if you guys haven't seen it, highly recommended. But the first third looks like a fairly terrible low budget zombie movie.
And
then it
all done
isn't
in one take. In
the second, and then by the third part, by the third act, it's just joyful.
It's
and
wonderful. Yeah, it is
absolutely amazing.
I completely forgot about One Cut of the Dead actually, because that is an original new take in a way
really
on
is,
the zombie. Because more previously to that, we talked before on what was the last kind of really new inventive zombie movie? Maybe Pontypool, but even that now is quite a long time ago. I think that was 2011 or something.
But I mean, we've had Train to Busan, obviously, which
was great, but kind of just a standard
traditional
zombie movie. Yeah.
But I think actually what we'd seen more recently is changing the concept of the zombie movie to not be about the masses, but to be about the individual.
Yes.
So, for example, Life After Beth.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which isn't about a massive undead people coming to get you. It's about couple, isn't it? It's about the death of a relationship and going back to something when it's kind of died, and her kind of, she's a character. In fact, and one of the first that I can remember, female sort of named zombie characters, because of course we had like Barb years and years ago.
Yeah, that's true.
In Day of the Dead, but less often would we see this sort of slightly sentient female character. But like Deadheads, which was a few years back, I think that's like 2010, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And that was really good. And that again was this sort of slight reinvention in that way of making it more personal and individual. I mean, I guess even like Nina Forever.
Yeah, Warm Bodies as well.
Warm Bodies, which didn't work, but was kind of the same sort of idea.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think there is that one, because generally you don't really think of zombies as too emotional, but they are all dealing with death, I suppose. And like you say, the ones that do that right, I think, that can work. That idea of like something that I think is introduced in Dawn of the Dead, which we're doing next week, but it's like what happens if a friend or loved one turns and you have to kill them, and that kind of thing, is quite it's a very well-known trope now of zombies, but that's quite an interesting one. It is,
but I guess what so more recently we've seen is that what if you yourself are a zombie, and so your body is letting you down, but your brain is still there, and like dealing with your own mortality, which actually is quite relevant for this
definitely
this podcast.
Definitely.
We also, so I read that World War Z 2 is off the table at the minute.
Is it?
Well, I read that yesterday.
It was David Fincher, wasn't it? Interesting.
But Zombieland 2 is definitely on its way.
It is on its way.
So, yeah, will that work? Will they find a way to innovate? I don't know.
Interesting. And also, I kind of feel like, maybe it's just me, but I feel like they've kind of missed the boat a bit with Zombieland. I kind of feel like, does anyone want that anymore, like a new Zombieland film? I don't know. It was quite
That's
big
true.
for quite a while ago, it feels like. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. And so it depends whether they find something new to do with it. Also, Resident Evil's being rebooted as well with Johannes Roberts, which is really exciting. Obviously a really good horror director.
And also, actually, that's something I want to pick up on what you just said, about female characters in zombie movies, because generally speaking as well, I talked about this briefly with Jamie about like zombie movies tend to be quite male. I think, like, compared to a lot of other subgenres of horror which aren't, like ghosts and even slashers are a bit more female centric, but the zombies are usually about men. And it kind of is often about battling alpha males almost, and these kind of things. And women get kind of a bit sidelined or are there to... Yeah, I mean, I don't know, depending on what movies you watch. Even if you take things like 28 Days Later, where it's about the soldiers and they want to rape the women, repopulate and all of that kind of thing, that tends to be a bit of a thing maybe with zombies as well. But, like you say, maybe recently as that started to change, do you think? Yeah,
I think, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think, it has been quite a masculine subgenre. But I think, like with... Life After Beth and things like that, it is perhaps kind of opening itself up in a way. But actually, again, interestingly, with the two films that we're going to talk about today, they're not uber masculine. There are masculine elements, but it's actually women that are the more interesting. Well, in my opinion, the more interesting characters.
100%, definitely, yeah. Obviously, we're going to talk about two movies. In some ways, arguable whether they are zombie movies, but I think interesting to like include in the conversation in a way, because what we've seen so far from zombies, we've seen the old voodoo ones that we've talked about, obviously very, very different, and then we've talked about George Romero's ones, but there is an element of zombies, I think, going forward that are much more to do with, like you say, body decay and infection and disease, more about that, like quote unquote clinical side of zombies rather than a kind of supernatural witchcrafty side or whatever. Obviously, like, so I think there's like a body horror connection there. We're going to talk about David Cronenberg's movies. This is the first time on this podcast we've ever covered David Cronenberg. So, first of all, just for people out there who might not know, who is David Cronenberg? What kind of a filmmaker is he, would you say?
So Cronenberg is a Canadian director. Who his first film was Shivers, which was 75, so kind of came to the fore in the early 70s. And so his background is that he studied and was sort of an expert in science and biological science particularly.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So what he's sort of credited with is really kind of pushing to the fore and kind of introducing this subgenre of body horror, which is all about it's horror from within, as opposed to an external thing being the threat. It's your own body. It's your own sort of it's your own body letting you down from within. Really,
my films tend to be very body conscious. The body and what it is and what it does and what it can do tends to be very central in my films, and it was never a conscious thing. But I gradually realized that I was more interested in things that happen inside you, mentally and physically, than I was in a kind of exterior threat, which is why you could, I think, legitimately say that none of my films are monster movies in that sense. In fact, to a certain extent, it's your own body that's the monster.
So Shivers and Rabid, which were his first two films, have a particular focus on. They're really icky, basically.
Really
and there's
icky.
Yeah, so there's a focus on sort of like decay, decrepitude, I suppose, which is picked up much more later with The Fly. But yeah, so he sort of blends genre with sort of science, I suppose.
Yes, agreed. And again, the previous films we've talked about together have been like bloodless movies, essentially. What are you a fan of, like body horror, gore, ickiness in horror?
I absolutely love body horror. So I'm not a massive gore fan in general. So I'm not a big splatter girl myself. But body horror I find particularly fascinating. I think the idea of your own physicality letting you down and how you deal with that as well, which is very, I think in Shivers particularly, what you do with that, what you do with your own sort of body rebelling against you is a really sort of interesting subject area. So yeah, body horror definitely a top one for me.
It is, like, for me, more disturbing and icky than any amount of splatter or gore, though, in kind of other subgenres. I think there's something really horrible about it in a good way, you know. It really gets you.
Right, and it's inescapable, of course, because it's your own body. So what are you going to do? There are scenes in other Cronenberg films of people trying to sort of reject that, reject their own corporeal changes, basically. But yeah, that's, in a way, that is the true terror, because of course what we're talking about is the fact that we are all trapped in our own bodies, and we're all going to die, and our bodies are going to let us down. So it's an inescapable fear, and in a way that makes it a really pure kind of horror.
I agree. I think that's what it is, isn't it? There's something very relatable, even though his movies are often sci-fi and they're often all kinds of weird stories. You know, you look at like Videodrome and stuff, but there's always something relatable about the body horror.
Even in a scene that is very horrific in my films, there's always an inventiveness, I hope, that it's not something that my audience would ever see in any other film, and so it's not just a matter of, graphic violence or anything like that. It's inventive and suggestive and metaphorical.
When you look at other zombie movies where you've got heads being lopped off and eyes being gouged out and stuff, it's so extreme that you kind of laugh at it, because in some ways it's so not, obvious. It's not relatable in any way. But there are something about like these movies where someone will have like a growth, or someone will have something pussy or icky, or it's like those little moments that are much more troubling, I find.
Yeah, and I think that sort of harks back to what you were saying about why people love zombie movies, because it can be fun, because it doesn't feel real, and it's like...
Yeah, it's kind of cathartic gore,
right,
isn't it?
So you can lop the head off a zombie and you don't have to feel guilty about it, and it's funny and it's gross, and you can sort of laugh at it with your mates. But when you're watching something where it's like, funny, but we are all going to die, like that is actually going to happen to us. Like, it's a real mood killer, basically.
Exactly. So are you a fan of Cronenberg's work in general?
Yes, I love Cronenberg. I can't say that I wouldn't call myself an expert. I haven't seen everything that he's done.
Yeah,
but
he's done a lot, hasn't he? That's the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't think of a Cronenberg movie I really don't like. Yes, I would absolutely say I'm a fan.
And do you like, because he's changed and evolved quite a lot over the years, and I think he was obviously very well known for body horror at this point in the 70s and 80s, and now recent movies like Maps to the Stars and things like that. I mean, do you like what he's sort of making now, some of his more recent ones?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and I think it's a really interesting kind of evolution. I think Spider was one of the early ones that he did, which I also really liked.
That weird one where Robert Pattinson is in a limo for the whole film.
Yeah, Cosmopolis.
That was quite weird. Yeah,
I didn't love Cosmopolis. I preferred Maps to the Stars, which I just thought was brilliant.
I loved it.
Even A Dangerous Method I really got on with. I thought that was just really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's becoming more psychological, isn't it? I mean, like with Maps to the Stars being, well, he says it's not a satire of Hollywood because it's so real, but
right.
This kind of extreme, horrific, and completely different. Yeah, in a different way. But yeah, I love it.
Brilliant. I loved Maps to the Stars. Have you seen Velvet Buzzsaw yet on Netflix?
I have. Yes.
Yeah, because I thought it was all right, but it just reminded me of how much I loved Maps to the Stars.
Yeah, agreed.
That kind of
and
how much
Nightcrawler.
more, and Nightcrawler. But like that Maps to the Stars was so much more like brilliantly bad taste and offensive when it wanted to be, which I think Velvet Buzzsaw, like I wanted more. I know everyone's saying this, but I wanted more teeth. Wanted more edges to that buzzsaw. Almost,
agreed. It felt it did feel a bit tame. It also didn't feel real. Whereas like Julianne Moore's character in Maps to the Stars is so awful, but so believable. And
that's it, and that's what Cronenberg does so well. It feels like these kind of heightened realities, but ones you can believe almost. It's like, ugh. Cool. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about Shivers then, from 1975.
If you think you're not afraid of the dark, if you think you have a strong stomach, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, then prepare yourself for a motion picture that takes you beyond fear, beyond your wildest nightmares, and brings you face to face with terror, beyond the power of priest or science to exercise.
So it starts off in a high-rise apartment.
Yes.
So it's supposed to be sort of luxury high-rise flats, and it's a young couple being shown around these apartments by this fairly sleazy sort of, I guess he's like general manager. And just as an aside, so they're shown this kitchen, which is like, it's all mod cons, and I was laughing when I was watching it because it's like none more 70s kitchen. But of course,
no,
it's like,
I love it.
Yeah, okay,
it's very of its time,
all
isn't
mod
it?
cons, if you like.
Yes.
But anyway, so we're introduced to this, in a slightly satirical way, to this amazing, expensive, luxury high-rise complex. But then we see a middle-aged guy, who we later find out is a doctor, but we'll come back to that, in the apartment of what looked to me at the time like a schoolgirl.
Yes.
In essentially school uniform.
Yeah, she
and
is.
It's a really, really uncomfortable scene, I thought.
Yeah.
Watching that, and I have seen it before, but I hadn't remembered that, and thought, what?
No, it's shocking.
What?
And the way it's kind of filmed is not like it's supposed to be shocking. Like, it almost seems just kind of like matter of fact or everyday. It's very
was
odd.
Disturbing, right? Watching it back.
Super disturbing.
So he's strangling this, what looks like a schoolgirl, and you can see like her pants and everything, and it's all a bit sexual and a bit off, and eventually he kills her, cuts her open, pours acid into her stomach, and then kills himself, which is a pretty strong opener,
right?
So this is where we begin. And of course, we don't know what's going on at this point. And it's an ensemble film.
Yes.
So we're introduced to various different residents of this skyrise, these different inhabitants, which includes a married couple, and the guy has got something in some sort of growth.
Yes.
We see him early on looking in the mirror, sort of prodding at his chest, which is moving slightly unnaturally. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
Yeah.
And then his wife, and then there's another lady played by Barbara Steele, and it's quite a sprawling plot. But essentially, what we see early on is this parasite, which looks like a poo.
It does look a kind of penis-shaped poo.
A penis poo.
Yeah.
That comes out of the mouth of one of the residents, Nick, I believe, which he then vomits over a balcony, hits an old lady's umbrella, and then slithers off into the bushes.
Yes.
So I'm not going to go through the whole film beat by beat, obviously, but the gist is that the doctor we see who kills himself in the early scene has been working with another colleague to create a parasite, which they later discover. So initially, it's to do with I can't remember now, but it's some kind of scientific, like positive scientific advancement.
These doctors are trying to like create parasites to replace organs.
Oh, it's organs.
I think.
That's right.
Yes.
But actually, it turns out that isn't what the other doctor was doing at all.
No.
He has this idea that humans have become over-intellectualized, and he wants to get people to make this parasite get people back to kind of an orgiastic state.
Yes.
And that's what he's done. And is using this schoolgirl who it turns out isn't supposed to be a schoolgirl, but really she looks like a
Very
schoolgirl.
odd. Yeah, it's very odd.
As like a guinea pig to have, because she's quite promiscuous and has sex with lots of men in this block. And essentially what happens from there is this parasite then spreads very, very quickly through this tower block, and mayhem ensues.
Yes, amazing. There's a lot going on there. So, first of all, what did you think of it? Are you a fan of this movie?
Yeah, so I first saw it years and years ago.
Yeah.
And there were scenes that I remember, obviously the scene in the bath. There's a very iconic scene where it's Barbara Steele in the bath, and the penis poo parasite comes up through the plug hole, and it's all very sexual and weird. And, so I'd remembered things like that, and I'd remembered the ending, but lots of it I hadn't remembered. And actually, I really liked it.
Yeah.
I thought the the opening intro, which is introducing you to the Starlight Apartments, was actually like, oh, that's actually quite unusual. And bear in mind, this was his first film. Like, that's actually quite a cool, kind of progressive, interesting way to start. Definitely,
yeah. Very like straight away with the kind of satire as well. I think you get, don't you, from the get go? Yeah, and it's yes. So that really works actually as this kind of juxtaposition. This idea that these are like really privileged people in this almost sort of closed off tower block, which kind of emphasizes this idea of being over protected and over intellectualized, and so it's a great setting.
Hello, I'm Ronald Merrick, and I'm here to invite you aboard our Starliner. Yes, it's true. Day-to-day living becomes a luxury cruise when you've made your home at Starliner Tower Apartments. Although downtown Montreal is only 12.5 minutes away, once you've crossed the Carrier Bridge to Starliner Island, the noise and the traffic of the city might as well be 1,000,000 miles away.
In some ways, it reminded me a bit of Ben Wheatley's High Rise.
Yes.
I think in some ways a better version of that, like the way in which it kind of, starts off all very kind of highbrow and these kind of intellectual rich people, and then the way it just descends into like these these people's kind of base animalistic kind of
it absolutely does. Yes, you're completely right. It did remind me of that. Also very slightly there's a movie called Citadel, which I really liked, which is also based on a high rise, but it's in Scotland and it's a different thing, but it's using that structure as a kind of a descent into hell, kind of an opposite of
nice.
So it's a high rise rather than a literal deep down dungeon thing, but it feels like a descent into hell, and that is essentially what Shivers becomes by the end. I mean, it becomes more and more shocking in terms of imagery. I mean, I'd say watching it again I'd not remembered the image of a man walking two young women like a dog, which was like, ooh.
It does get completely surreal. I know.
So no, actually I really did enjoy it. I thought it was like, wow, gosh, this is great.
And it's Cronenberg's first feature film. I mean, like, again, do you kind of, with a lot of directors, when you go back and watch their very first feature, everything kind of looks a bit maybe rough and ready compared to maybe what some of them were. How do you think this compares to some of his more famous, celebrated works like The Fly and, Videodrome?
I think the biggest thing that you will notice, if you haven't seen Shivers and you have seen The Fly, is the creature effects, which aren't great, quite honestly. So there's quite a lot of people sort of grabbing hold of this parasite and like doing the movement for themselves.
The penis poo,
Yeah, exactly. And that if you weren't expecting it, that might be a slight sticking point. I mean, it does have humour in it. It is actually supposed to be quite funny. That isn't an accident. He hasn't accidentally made it look like a penis and a poo. That's like definitely on purpose. But it is a little bit, I don't know, rough and ready, I guess, if you want to say that.
I guess, yeah. But I think generally it's like you say, it's very strong for like a first film, and it really kind of sets you up for his whole career almost, doesn't it? The satirical elements, the body horror, everything. It's like, and the science and sex. Like, I think sex is like a really strong element in all of his movies. Not in a kind of, I mean, again, there's that weird thing with this movie, how much it's maybe a bit like trying to be a bit titillating. There's a lot of boobs and there's a lot of like you say, women in school uniforms. And but what's he saying about sex in general? I mean, it feels to me like there's a lot of sides to sex that Cronenberg seems to be afraid of, I think.
So that's really interesting. I think that depends on how you see the end, how you interpret the end of the film.
Yes.
So I didn't think that, and having read around a little bit, so you could view it as being quite damning of sex and being like, oh god, this is a descent into hell. But you could also see it the opposite way, because everybody's happy at the end.
Yes, well that's true. It becomes a kind of utopia in a way.
Exactly. So it's almost, I think I would tend to lean on the side of feeling that actually he's like, you can't, denying that is the problem, and not letting go. And actually, once you just go with it, then everything's a bit easier and a bit nicer. And and we are all decaying. I mean, so the character of Nick is quite interesting, who we see, he's already infected when we see him. We understand that he's been infected by Annabelle, I think she was called, the schoolgirl. But later we see him in bed, like talking to the parasite in his body,
as it's kind of
and like it's pulsing, and he's like, "Oh, hello," and like, you know, actually embracing it and rather nurturing it. So I think, in a sort of weird reverse pregnancy thing, I think that was going on there. Or not entirely sure what that means, but so actually, I don't know whether I do think it's particularly damning of sex. I actually think that it maybe had more interesting things. I think it was more damning of a particular male kind of approach to sex. So so in the film, men and women are infected, but the men become very rapey. The women don't. Well, they're pushy, but the scene between the two women, Barbara Steele's one of them, I can't remember the actress. Suzanne Petrie is kind of nice and kind of tender.
Yes.
Just like, oh, you're so beautiful.
Let's kiss and make up, make love to me, shall I? Make love to me, make love to me, make love to me. Let's kiss and make up, kiss.
Whereas the guys are like really, really rapey.
Yeah, that's very true. Yes, because again, is it Nick who's like, "You're my wife, we're gonna make love," blah blah blah. That guy, yeah.
And towards the end, so the one of the doctors, who sort of uncovers it, who is incredibly sleazy, by the way, all the way through. I don't know whether that's deliberate, but he is so sleazy. He's wandering through. So his assistant and girlfriend is infected. So she like basically everybody's all over the shop at this point, and he's walking through, and there's a scene of a dad getting off with his daughter, and he's gone and he's shot and killed Nick, but he sees all these scenes of like. There's a scene of a guy like definitely raping a woman, doesn't do anything about that. Bloke walking two little girls like dogs, walking away from that. Absolutely, completely ignores it. And he's the one finally at the end who goes to the swimming pool scene, which is the sort of iconic closer, and is then finally dragged into this orgy. So I don't know if I think it's damning of sex. I don't think it's rape positive. I don't think it's saying rape is all right. I think it's saying an accepting kind of, even if it's really kinky and weird, sex. Like the two women in the pool are having a great time.
Totally. I think it's because maybe there's an element, and maybe I'm thinking more of some of his later films as well, of a kind of STI element too, that there always seems to play into a lot of his movies as well. And I know a load of people kind of talk about The Fly in the context of the kind of AIDS epidemic that was happening at the time, and again the kind of I don't know, there are just certain connotations to like sex equals infection or disease, in a lot of his movies. But maybe you're right. Maybe not so much in Shivers, and there is a possibility that I suppose the world could turn into a happier place by the end.
You are right though that it does have that STI element to it. It feels a sexually transmitted
the way
parasite.
It kind of spreads through this building, so quickly, and that they are all kind of sleeping with each other and everything, and they're all having affairs and things, aren't they? And again, it's these horrible men and these doctors, isn't it?
But that's the thing, they were already all having affairs, so they already had that element of corruption.
Yes, you're right.
Within the constructs of that building, not the women so much, but the guys, and so it's like
releasing that repression almost.
Because you do. I definitely did get the sense that like Janine is better off out of that. By the end, that she's now suddenly allowed to be her own person and express her own sexuality in whatever way.
Totally. And like obviously The Fly is, I think, wonderful because it's so like personal and it's essentially just these two characters, whereas this movie, obviously, like we said, it's a big ensemble cast. I mean, is that a weakness for you? How did you find it in terms of just this big cast of characters, and how well drawn are these characters, I suppose?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it isn't as an accomplished as a film as The Fly, and so the big cast is a little bit annoying sometimes because it feels a bit like in the middle that you're going from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing, so it becomes a little bit repetitive. And I think we'll talk about this in a bit, but I think that's very much the case with Rabid, and actually can be the case with zombie movies in general. If you haven't got a clear focus, and so also you don't in Shivers. You don't really care about anyone in it.
No, I agree.
It's not that movie. You don't always have to, but you don't really have a key protagonist. The closest you've got is Dr. St. Luke.
Yeah,
who's such a sleazebag.
Yeah.
That you, like there's a scene in it with with his girlfriend assistant.
Yes.
And she is infected, and she tells him this weird story about a fantasy about having sex with an old man, which he's like really grossed out about. And then he sees the parasite come out of her mouth, and he punches her in the face.
Yes.
And it's quite the shocking thing.
It's a very odd moment, that.
It is very odd. And he's really grossed out by that. And it's like, well, all right. But, you know,
I know.
compared to some of the things going on here, she's... The way she talks, I think it's really interesting, because the way she talks about it is she's like, any sex is okay, you know.
And she sort of said everything is erotic and all that.
Everything is erotic,
great.
exactly.
Yeah.
Roger, I had a very disturbing dream last night. In this dream, I found myself making love to a strange man. Only I'm having trouble, you see, because he's old and dying. And he smells bad, and I find him repulsive. But then he tells me that everything is erotic, that everything is sexual. He tells me that even old flesh is erotic flesh, that disease is the love of two alien kinds of creatures for each other, that even dying is an act of eroticism. And I believe him. And we make love beautifully.
He's absolutely freaked out by, which again potentially would sort of lend support to the idea that no, actually she's now more liberated than him, and he can't cope with it, and punches her in the face and then gags her, which is again a really really iconic like looking sequence where he's walking through with her with a blood-stained gag across her mouth with parasite.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so this seems like a good opportunity for me to play you a little bit of my interview with the actress Lynn Lowry. Now, you heard her just a second ago in that clip. She was the one giving that iconic monologue about, I had a dream that everything was sexual and that everything was erotic. And, you know, I think she's one of the most memorable and key figures in Shivers from 1975. So I was really lucky to get to sit and have a little chat with her about her role in the movie, about her career in the horror genre, and about working with legends such as David Cronenberg and George Romero. She was also in another sort of zombie-adjacent movie, The Crazies. So loads of interesting stuff to chat to Lynn about. So here is some of my conversation with the brilliant Lynn Lowry. Okay, I'm very excited to welcome to the podcast Lynn Lowry. Hello, Lynn. How are you doing?
Hello. Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
So, Lynn, you've had such an incredible career in the horror genre. And I just wondered, you know, looking all the way back to some of those movies you made in the 70s, like The Crazies and obviously Shivers, how important were those movies to the career that you ended up having, do you think?
They were absolutely essential. I mean, without I Drink Your Blood, The Crazies, Shivers, and Cat People, I would probably have no career right now. So they really gave me a second opportunity to, when all of them, you know, came out on DVD and everything, that gave me a second opportunity to really start working as an actress, which is what I, you know, always wanted to do. I mean, back then, I don't even know how many people saw I Drink Your Blood. I know The Crazies was not successful at all. And Shivers, you know, I mean, Canada, the Canadian government was like, you know, going to ban Cronenberg from making the movie in Montreal. And I mean, I don't think very many people really knew about that movie. It's taken, you know, a few years for it took a few years for the movies to be recognized at all. And I think it took even longer for them to really, really be appreciated and loved by the fans.
So tell me a bit about making Shivers. I mean, what sort of memories do you have of being on set? What kind of a movie was it like to make at the time?
Well, it was actually a very difficult film to make because we were shooting a lot at night. And so night shoots are always, you know, the most difficult. Obviously because you're used to being awake in the daytime, not up all night long. But I think that overall, David was, fantastic to work with. And this was his very first movie. So he was young and ambitious and hungry and, really wanted to have a hit, on his hands. And so his energy level and everything was extremely high. And he was always very, very supportive of me, especially he pretty much let me do whatever I felt was right at the moment. I don't honestly remember him ever directing me. He spent a lot of time directing Paul Hampton, and but overall we were in Montreal. I'd never been to Canada before. We were going out for these dinners, with these fancy French, food, quail under glass and all kinds of stuff like that. So that was a lot of fun, to get to enjoy that. So, other than working with Paul Hampton, which was a little bit difficult at times, it was a very good experience.
Oh wow! And do you mind if I ask what was it about Paul Hampton that was difficult in terms of working with him?
Well, first of all, Paul had a really bad habit of trying to upstage me. He would always try to, in an embrace, he would try to pull my face into his shoulder so that the camera would not see me. So I was constantly, having to sort of try to push him away from me so that I could, be seen by the camera. And he had a lot of trouble with lines, and I think he was having some trouble with the character. Again, David seemed to spend a lot of time working with him. On one particular instance, in the car scene, when we're in the garage and we're trying to get out of the building, he was supposed to very gently run the car into this barrier. And he just really, really ran it into that barrier. I mean, you can see both of our necks snap. I was pretty pissed off at him for that. And then when we had to push the windshield out, which is pretty funny because it's all in one piece and it just comes out. And we finally got out of the car. He kind of broke down and started crying, and apparently it had some kind of traumatic incident with a car when I don't know how old he was when it happened, but David had to hold him in his arms and coddle him and make sure he was okay and everything. So, there were just some things like that I was, kind of rolled my eyes at a few times.
Yeah, it sounds like it. But it's interesting because you two have got great chemistry on the film, and there's that very iconic scene now where you give that sort of monologue about how you had a dream about being with the old man, and I feel like that's one of the most kind of iconic, memorable moments in the film now. I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about what it was like to film that particular scene, particularly where you have the parasite in your mouth at the end as well, because it still looks so disturbing, that moment. I just wondered what that was like to film.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that was that they had actually sent me home. They had wrapped me, and then they brought me back to be in the swimming pool. I wasn't originally written into the swimming pool scene to give the parasite to Paul.
Oh, right.
And I originally didn't have that monologue in the steam room with Paul. So that was all written. And when they called me back, I had been studying acting and learning how to make my voice a little less breathy. And so my voice kind of went down, a little bit in that monologue than it had been, I think, throughout the rest of the film. And the only thing I was worried about in that scene was I was worried about when Paul punches me, that he was going to be able to not really punch me in the face.
Yes, yeah.
Because Paul and I actually really did not have very much chemistry together at all. He pretty much just acted by himself, And even in that scene where I strip,
Yeah.
that's not, I didn't strip to Paul. Paul wasn't even there that day I did that scene. David Cronenberg was sitting where Paul should be sitting, so I actually stripped for David Cronenberg. And then they brought Paul in at another time, and he, was on the phone pretending to watch me strip, but I was not there. So we didn't really have a whole lot of chemistry,
Wow, that's really interesting. But it sounds like David Cronenberg was a good director to work with, though, to sort of complement that, I suppose.
Yes, he was, and I think that what happened was that Paul turned out to really be very good in the film, and really had the correct responses, even though there was a kind of an indifference about him that seemed to really work, for the film. So it all turned out great in the end.
And what was it like working with that little parasite thing and shooting that particular scene where it sort of came out of your mouth and the blood comes out of your mouth?
It's just, after I did the monologue, they stuck that thing on my tongue, in my mouth, and put a blood capsule in my mouth, and I just bit the blood capsule and stuck my tongue out.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's coming out of my mouth. But the funny thing about that was, right afterwards, I went into the ladies' room, and when I walked into the ladies' room, there were two women in there who lived in the building, and I, of course, had blood all over my face, and they looked at me. First they looked at me kind of horrified, and then they said, "Oh, you must be making a horror film, right?"
They knew what was going on.
Yeah, right. So.
That's brilliant. And I wondered as well, what's your take on what happens to your character? Did you think of these characters as when they did have the parasite in them, are they ultimately happier? Are they liberated? I just wondered what your take on that, on the ending of the film was.
Yes. When I come up in slow motion out of the pool, which is, by the way, my favorite piece of film on me, visually, that I have. I love that moment. And when I turned to start to walk towards Paul, my intention was to have a certain kind of seductive, but evil, beauty about her. And there was definitely, the parasite caused if nothing else, a tremendous sexual freedom. So I was trying to really let that sexuality, come across in that moment as I, went towards him. And I was just so excited to get to give Paul the parasite too. I was really excited about that. And at the very end, when we all go out, they should have, done another one, a Shivers too, because we all go out, into the world, and we're going out there to have sex with everyone, turn them into us.
I know. I wonder if it would have made the world a better place ultimately. If this had spread across the world.
Yeah, well, it would have definitely been a real sexed up world, that's for sure.
And I wonder, at the time, David Cronenberg, obviously, like you say, this was his first film. Did you have an idea at that point, having worked with other directors and then working with Cronenberg, did you have an idea that maybe this guy was going to become somebody really special and really big, Did any of that sort of come across when working with him?
I mean, I loved working with him, but I hadn't really done that many films at that point, but he didn't seem to be as experienced as George Romero was.
Yeah.
Because, George had done three films, I think, by the time we did The Crazies. Maybe, I think three or four. So, I really didn't, I had no idea the power that Shivers would have, and that 40 years later, that people would, love that movie, and even can recite my monologue, from that scene that you mentioned earlier. I mean, it's really pretty powerful. So I hoped that the film would be successful, and I hoped that David would be successful, but I had no idea, that he would go on to do what he's done.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's fantastic. And I just wondered, obviously, you've been in so many of these iconic horror movies. What's your opinion on the horror genre just as a viewer? I mean, do you like horror movies? Do you enjoy watching them?
Oh, yes. I very much enjoy horror. My mom actually lives with me, and she's 91, and she loves horror films too. I know. So we watch everything together. I mean, she's seen everything from Texas Chainsaw Massacre to, to The Ring.
That's amazing.
And everything in between. So yes, it's my favorite genres to watch. I mean, I love other genres as well, but I'm a real big sucker for horror films.
That's brilliant. And do you have a favorite? What's your favorite horror movie?
Oh gosh, there's so many, and I have different categories. I mean, my favorite kind of satanic horror film is the original, The Omen, with Gregory Peck, and I just think that's a perfect movie. And I loved Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. I think it's truly frightening. I remember seeing that, one of the first films that I'd seen. I love Halloween. I love the Japanese films, The Ring, and I liked The Audition. I thought that was a brilliant film, and I have many, many, many favorites.
What are you up to at the moment? Are you doing any more acting at the moment, or any projects coming up that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I've actually done more projects in the last 10 years than I've done in my whole life. So, and I've worked in London now for the last few years. I've done films there, and there's a wonderful society which I'd like to mention called the Misty Moon Society.
Oh, yes.
Which is a film. They show films. They have a little film festival. They meet at the Cinema Museum, which is a fantastic place to go to. And I just did a film with Stuart Morris and Jason Reed called Ready for My Close-Up, which was wonderful. And we're going to be doing the prequel to that this coming November. I'll be over there again for like the 5th or 6th year in a row. So I have, that's coming out. And I have just so many things coming out. I can't even think of them right now. But my favorite new film that I've done, and I'd love to recommend this to people to see if they haven't seen it, is Model Hunger, directed by Debbie Rochon. So I star in that, and that is, I play a schizophrenic Southern Belle serial killer. And it's one of my favorite roles. So yeah, and I love the fans, and I love that they still support me and love my early work and love my new work too.
Brilliant. Well, it's been such a pleasure chatting to you, Lynn. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for thinking of me.
A big thank you to the brilliant Lynn Lowry there. Such a treat to get to sit and chat to her for a bit. Now, let's continue as me and Rosie Fletcher round off our discussion of David Cronenberg's Shivers. And the bath scene we've talked about it already, but that is amazing. Yeah. That is a well done. Because like you say, the effects are a bit rough and ready, and the monster doesn't look particularly scary, but that scene still is creepy and scary, I think.
It's creepy and scary, but also sort of sexy and weird.
Yeah, exactly. And that pretty much sums up a lot of his movies, creepy, scary, sexy and weird, that's it.
Yeah.
From just a horror perspective, do you find this movie scary in that kind of way? Is it affecting as a horror movie?
No, it isn't. And I don't know that it's even supposed to be.
Interesting, yeah.
In the sense that, because you're not really invested in anyone, but also because being infected with this parasite doesn't equal death.
No.
It equals a lack of control, but not a lack of sentience. So, talking about it in context of zombie movies, certainly older traditional zombie movies, you aren't yourself at all.
Yes,
you're just like this shambling thing, and you can't speak and you don't have any emotions. Whereas in this, they are still somewhat themselves. Yeah. They've just now got a massively heightened sense of sex, basically, that they just want to have a good time.
Yes.
And I guess if we're talking about, like, you know, within the world of Cronenberg, which is about your body letting you down, then this idea of, well, we might as well just have a good time, maybe isn't the worst, you know.
And I think that is I think that is what gives us the kind of zombie link as well in some ways. Like Mary Wild was telling me on the podcast, you know, there's a kind of connection between zombies and the kind of the id, I suppose, you know, like the kind of, you know, and I guess that is similar to what happens to these people and they're not eating each other or anything, but just the kind of, you know, like the term they use, you know, just they lose intellectualism and just embrace kind of their
just come base
urges, you know, or whatever. I mean, do you kind of see this? Do you see this in any way, like having an influence or a link to zombie movies and infection movies that we see in the future? Do you think?
So I wouldn't say Shivers is a zombie movie.
Yeah.
But I think that it is absolutely an infection movie, even though it's like, you know, it's a parasite that you can actually see rather than like an airborne.
In some ways, a bit more like a Body Snatchers type movie, isn't it? Like a pod people in some ways, like this thing kind of jumping into bodies and taking over.
Although in Body Snatchers, I love Body Snatchers, but of course the real versions of them are dead, are gone.
True.
So
True.
it's
They've
not
been replaced.
so it isn't.
Right.
So that's less. That's a different kind of body horror, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
So I don't see it so much in that way. But I think this obviously was a very clear precursor to Rabid, which, although is arguable whether it is or isn't, has way more connections
to zombies. Definitely.
So given that this club obviously influenced that.
Yes.
You know.
And
it's
that kind
the
of stepping stone, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Amazing. So overall then, you know, this movie's like, 44 years old now. How do you think it holds up? Would you still recommend this to people that haven't seen it?
Yeah, I absolutely would. Yes, definitely. Although I would say I would recommend it to people who, if you like Cronenberg, that's going to help.
Yeah.
It is a bit gross. Both this and Rabid have some, even though it doesn't have Rabid more so, but there's quite a lot of food grossness. Which I really don't like. I'm not good with that. So I'd say like food grossness warning for anyone who's not okay with that. Like, and it is funny, and it's also not very long. So there's that.
Yeah, it's true. I think the grossest moment is when he throws up the thing over the balcony. Yeah. It lands on the umbrella. It's funny, but it's also just grotesque.
Oh! Good heavens! Look.
Absolutely grotesque.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of that.
Yeah.
So you've got to be good with that. I mean, it's got a B movie vibe.
It does.
But it's almost like an elevated B movie.
I agree. I think there's always these kind of intellectual elements to Cronenberg movies, no matter what, isn't there?
Yeah.
The first step is to get her tied up and gagged. She'll probably try to run and scream.
Is everything all right, sir?
Everything's fine.
You could still kill him.
What?
Hello, everyone. Now, what you just heard there was a little clip from the new movie from Nicholas Pesky called Piercing. Piercing is an incredibly weird, fucked up, scary and brilliant new sort of giallo-esque horror thriller. Nicholas Pesky is the director who gave us The Eyes of My Mother from a few years back. Now, I'm sure if anyone has seen that, they'll remember certain images from that movie very, very well, and this movie is no different. Now, for any patrons out there, you are going to be treated to a bonus episode in which I am joined by graphic artist Mike Lee Graham, and we discuss Piercing in depth, in spoiler-free and spoilerific detail. So if you want to hear that chat, you just need to donate $5 per month and become a patron at the Evolution of Horror. Not only will you be treated to regular bonus episodes, you'll also be sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if you're based in the UK, and you will very soon be treated to discounts on upcoming Evolution of Horror merchandise. So just go to patreon.com/Evolution of Horror and sign up now. And on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to all of the new patrons that have signed up and pledged $5 this week, including Hunter Robinson, Trevor Renstrom, Mike Lee Graham and Nicola Peters. A big thank you to all of those people. And once again, if you want to become a patron of the Evolution of Horror and to support everything that we do here and defray the costs of making the podcast, just go to patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Now, let's return to our chat about David Cronenberg's follow-up movie, Rabid from 1977.
Don't scream. Don't panic. He's dead, and the dead can't hurt the living. Rabid.
The Prime Minister was reluctant to officially declare a state of emergency, but as any citizen in the streets can tell you, martial law has come to Montreal.
Standing over that way, please. Get that guy. I'm sorry, sir. You can't go right. I'm sorry, sir. You don't have a card. Down, please.
Shooting down the victims is as good a way of handling them as we have got.
Stop! Stop or I'll shoot!
Okay, so Rabid, we start with a couple, Rose and Hart, they're called, and Rose is played by Marilyn Chambers, who at the time was quite famous for being a porn star.
Yes.
And Frank Moore as Hart. But anyway, they have an accident. They have a motorcycle accident, and Hart has some fractures and some problems with his arms. But Rose is really badly hurt, to the point where she's in intensive care. She's in a coma. She's really been burned. Yes. So they do a sort of a slightly experimental skin graft, essentially, to a couple of parts of her body, and she's in a coma for quite a long time, I think. And then when she comes round, basically she finds that she has a sort of a growth under her armpit, and is hungry for blood. So early on, when just after she's come around, she comes around screaming.
Yes.
And a neighbouring patient goes to her to comfort her, and when she cuddles him, essentially, she ends up sort of piercing his skin and hurting him. And she's behaving strange. She doesn't really remember a lot of things, and we then discover that she has kind of grown a sort of penis in her armpit.
You're already starting to see the sort of recurring themes.
I mean, but that is essentially what it is.
Totally, it is.
It's a very sharp kind of protrusion.
Yeah,
but very, very phallic.
Yes.
That she then goes on to. So basically, she kind of uses it to sort of suck the blood from other people, which she is hungry for, and then they get infected. But she crucially does not. So she's kind of patient zero. And although she's got this armpit penis, she remains relatively normal. Like she looks normal. She talks normal. She's peppy and cool. However, the people that she infects do not remain normal, and they become actually much more like traditional zombies in terms of how they look. So they're very sort of pale skin, and they can still talk, but like they're sort of hungry for flesh, basically.
Yes.
And then essentially we've got a movie which takes that and runs with it. So it's so the infection spreads really, really rapidly, and towards the end we have a fairly 28 Days Later-esque sense that this is going to get bigger and wider and global.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think of it? How does it compare to Shivers for you?
So I have to say I didn't like it as much. I watched the two kind of back to back, and I found Shivers much more inventive and funnier.
Yeah, it's definitely this one takes itself a lot more seriously.
It does,
it? Yes.
yeah. I mean, it's probably higher production values,
and
it is a bit more sprawling. I mean, Shivers is very self-contained, whereas this is not as self-contained, which is good.
It's obviously got a bit more money. There's a lot of like car crashes and stuff,
and
crashes, there's like a big lorry crash and a motorbike crash, and it feels a lot more like he's opening it out. It's because there's a similar story really in some ways to Shivers, isn't it? But it feels like he's got the money to kind of open it out a bit more. But I don't know whether if that's sort of in its favour in a way, because when it first started I thought, this is interesting. Is the whole thing going to be set in the cosmetic surgery like clinic or hospital, and is it going to be about that, and I thought, is Cronenberg going to be commenting on that? But it kind of left that quite early on.
Yeah, by the end it's
not really about that at all.
Do that.
Yeah.
And I think, probably at the time, so we're talking 1977, it probably was quite scary and effective. And I know that like Rabid was the film rather than Shivers that really pushed Cronenberg kind of into the public eye. The trouble is watching it now, when we've seen a lot of this stuff before, it's quite repetitive. So it's quite a person gets infected and somebody else and somebody else and somebody else, and we see her, and also because we all understand the rules of it. And although this isn't the same, the rules aren't necessary. This isn't just a straight zombie movie. It's got like a vampirism element to it as well. Of course,
definitely, yeah.
It does become a bit predictable, I think.
Yeah, it's true. It becomes a bit more formulaic than an average Cronenberg movie in a way, doesn't it?
So even there's an early scene, which is a really effective scene, of Rose trying to sort of, don't know what the right word is, but basically consume the blood of a cow, of a living cow.
Yes.
But she then is really sick because obviously it's explaining to us that no, it needs to be human blood. But that is something that we've seen that that's been around. It probably hadn't at that point, but just the punch of that, the eeriness and the ickiness of that just didn't hit for me watching it again.
Yes, it's true. In some ways, it was actually less icky than Shivers. The some of the like the practical effects are better.
Yes,
I think.
they are better. Yes.
Actually, even right at the beginning when you see them doing the skin graft, that's quite gross. That kind of thing always gets me, and it's quite well done. Yeah. But yeah, and I remember for years having not even seen this and being really creeped out as a kid by the VHS cover. And it's got that image of that woman in the sort of freezer, the dead body, or in the cupboard, or whatever it is she's in.
Yeah, she's in a freezer.
She's in a freezer, isn't she? Yeah. And I remember always thinking, oh, that looks like it's going to be really gross and really scary. Yeah. And I'm sure it did. I think, like you said, it had a better audience reaction than Shivers did. It was much more popular, wasn't it? And sort of made Cronenberg more of a name in terms of horror and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it has, it is slicker.
Yes.
And it has more of a sense of character in many ways. So Rose and Hart are kind of your protagonist from the start, and it is very much like Hart worrying about her. He's good, I think. I liked him in it.
Yes.
And her not really wanting to accept what's going on with her, basically.
Yeah, I was a bit confused by how aware she was of this thing that she had, and how good or bad she was, in terms of like, is she meant to be like an evil character now, or is she not? It's kind of a bit I don't know whether that's the writing or her. How do you think Marilyn Chambers, like you say, she was at this point famous for porn movies and that kind of thing, how do you think she does in the sort of lead role?
Well, so when I watched it, didn't realise that. I was just like, oh yeah, it's another 70s actress that I don't necessarily recognise. And actually I really liked her and warmed to her. So there's a hitchhiking scene, and like I just think, she's really.
Yes, that's right.
I like that scene very much.
Yeah.
When all this carnage is behind her, and she's sort of jumping around at the side of the road, going, "I thought I'd never get home."
Yeah.
Hi. Where are you going?
Montreal. Where are you going?
Same place.
Great. I was beginning to think I'd never get home again.
Yeah, so I actually thought she was really good. However, you are right. I wasn't ever really entirely clear how much awareness. I don't think she's supposed to be an evil character, and certainly the ending of the film suggests that isn't the case.
Yes, that's right.
Because at the end, of course, she. A lot of bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
But she ends up getting killed.
Yeah.
And the implication is that because she was immune and patient zero, she might have been the world's best chance for redemption, and then they've just let her die, and she's died, and they've just thrown her in a dumpster or something like that.
Yeah, actually the ending I found quite powerful. We'll get to that, but that had a bit of a sort of Romero-esque ending, I thought.
Yes,
the
you're right,
quite a sucker punch.
Yeah.
But yes, and until then it's kind of quite generic. And I think, like you said, there's definitely there you can see the kind of evolution of the zombie movie happening, I think, throughout this movie, and some of the tropes that, again, maybe now, like you say, we've seen 100 times, were being, I think, introduced in this movie.
Right, so there's a scene on a subway train, which is quite effective, and again, of course, you think, oh, Train to Busan.
Yeah.
But again, it's this gleeful, slightly sort of blue-hued, the very, very pale zombie, and it's like, this carnage about
coming
to begin.
Straight for the neck, or like trying to bite them as well. And then we start to get that kind of end of the world pandemic situation where it becomes a kind of what do you call it, like a military. Like basically with the military kind of take over, don't they? And you see, kind of patrolling around, hanging out of trucks with guns, and again, it's like people being shot, and the world becoming this like more and more fucked up, mainly due to the way that humans kind of react to these crises as well, which is what a lot of zombie movies are about, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I would be very surprised if Cronenberg wasn't influenced by Night of the Living Dead in that sense of this kind of. So we see quite quickly, and it escalates very quickly in Rabid. How callously the military now will be just shooting someone
exactly
if they're displaying these signs, and it's going from something going from 0 to 60 in seconds, basically.
Yes, exactly. And suddenly, it's not so much, it's that kind of stuff that we become more scared of, I think, as the movie goes on, than maybe the monsters themselves, this kind of like mass panic and end of the world scenario that happens in so many of these types of movies.
And much more so than in Shivers, for example, the characters who are infected do lose themselves and become really disgusting, actually.
Yes.
And then, are almost... like killed like cattle, basically. They're not people anymore. So I think that massively feeds into the zombie genre, but also at the time was probably quite a scary thing. I mean, effects wise, and grossness wise, is pretty envelope pushing, I think.
It is, definitely. And just the idea of like kind of, I think it's a scare for me. I find it always quite scary idea. This idea of like a big pandemic wiping people out or spreading infections, the 28 days later type thing. Those types of stories are scary. And whenever you hit, it's like, it feels like every now and then, every few years on the news, there'll be some huge panic of like swine flu or bird flu or something, and then it kind of goes away. But there's always this like panic that at any moment something like that could happen, right?
And how society's just going to fall apart, basically. And again, with this, it does focus on these two lead characters, so you've got the backdrop of society, and that's how the movie ends, really, with these news reports as well. And you know, this is going to be a nightmare, this isn't going to be all right. And within that, these two people who are like were a nice couple. So I mean, all of that does work. I just found it a bit repetitive, and I don't know, it just didn't massively sustain the tension.
No, I think, like you say, because it's a little bit more recognizable as one, as part of the genre, it's a little bit more predictable. And again, if you're not going to be scared or repulsed by these like endless kind of death sequences, then there's not much else, I guess, with this movie.
And I guess even though the sort of armpit penis, it's like, what's that about then? I don't know that actually really ever gets explored.
No, it doesn't really. It's just there, isn't it? And it's interesting that it's called Rabid as well, because they do talk about at the beginning, don't they?
They think it's rabies.
They think it's rabies. Yeah.
But I mean, they froth at the mouth, don't they?
Yes.
And there's a scene of an old guy going into a diner. He's the bloke that she's infected in the previous scene, but like grabbing somebody else's food and stuffing his face, and that it's so disgusting. That kind of thing. But I mean, that's not a symptom of rabies.
Food grossness.
I'm telling you,
grossness is
like
horrible. What do you remember the Peter Jackson movie Brain Dead? We're going to be covering that. That for me is one of those, because again, you've got the kind of fun cathartic gore of like him with a lawnmower slicing through all these, but then there's moments like where a woman like coughs something up or squeezes a spot or something, and the pus goes into someone's dinner, and like all of those moments, it's like they are the worst.
I can't bear that. Or like Drag Me to Hell, which is a film I really like.
Love it.
I was dry heaving watching that, because there's so much things going in people's mouths
and things.
Eyeball.
It's so disgusting.
I can't bear it. Or even that movie Cheap Thrills, which is absolutely brilliant.
Amazing
Highly recommend
film
to anyone who's not seen it.
Yeah.
There's one scene in that with a dog.
Yeah.
I had to walk out. I watched it on DVD. I had to walk out.
Yeah.
Like, I'll be back in a sec. I'm not watching this. So
that
grim.
Is amazing. Yeah, it's true. And I hate those kind of small bits of body horror that you get in things like Black Swan, even where she like kind of peels off her neck, all of that kind of thing, like a hangnail. Always the worst types of things for me. And that's one of the things I find most effective about Cronenberg's movies in general. Okay, so overall they're not quite as hot on this one. I mean, I guess we talked about this a lot with various films on the podcast. You kind of recognise that it's an important film in the kind of history of the genre and in Cronenberg and that kind of thing. But other than that, I guess maybe there's a bit less to enjoy.
For me, I don't know, I think I just found it a little bit less inventive than Shivers, a little bit funnier, a little less funny, and a little bit more generic, so I probably wouldn't go back and revisit it again. It's not going to be one that I'm going to be popping on a Friday night. But I think if you haven't seen it, it's worth a look. I mean, there's things to like about it.
Definitely. Where would you go for, like, in terms of, again, for people out there maybe that aren't as familiar with Cronenberg's work, what's your favourite? What one would you most recommend in his career?
Well, so those two things aren't actually the same. My favourite is Dead Ringers. I absolutely love Dead Ringers. I think it's brilliant. But Dead Ringers is quite a difficult film in lots of ways. And it's also it is horror, but it's a particular kind of horror. I think so. If you've not seen a Cronenberg movie, then The Fly is the one that you must see. It's absolutely brilliant. It's utterly disgusting. It has all of the themes, but probably in the most concentrated way. So the idea of like a decaying body, decrepitude, fear of disease, AIDS, as you mentioned, but also the idea of potentially even transcending that. So, initially he is, he's disgusted with himself, but then he becomes stronger and he becomes more sexually voracious and
Yes.
is exploring this idea of becoming something new and transcending his decrepit body. So it's absolutely core Cronenberg in terms of like the things that it talks about.
And it's also just so it's tragic. It's
absolutely
it's
tragic,
emotional and moving and
Yeah.
sad, and it's wonderful, and it's like a love story as well at its core
it
as well,
absolutely
isn't
is.
it?
Yeah, so it really hits all the beats. It's really, really brilliant. Also, the effects are fantastic. It's kind of a perfect film, and if you like that sort of thing, and absolutely core body horror as well.
Yeah, agreed. Amazing. And then, what is your favourite zombie movie then?
I don't know.
Yeah,
No, it's Night of the Living Dead. I think it has to be Night of the Living Dead, which is it's brilliant. It's terrific, and that always makes its way onto my certainly top 15 horror movies of all time. It's great, and I do rewatch that.
It's such a disturbing ending, isn't it?
It's really clever,
it's the sucker punch. Yeah,
and the ending is killer. I mean, there's been other things that I've enjoyed since then. You know, like Train to Busan, I was really really fond of. But that one, I think, has got to be, that's the classic. Isn't it?
It is the classic. Yeah, interesting as well, because like I think it has that reputation again of being like, oh, it's an important film, but it's a bit of a dated, difficult film to watch nowadays. But
so I don't find that. I actually find it really quite scary, and I don't find zombie movies scary very often. But there's something about that is like it's the strangeness and the panic and that feeling being inside that house, and and the scene with the little kid is just properly disturbing.
Yeah, the way that it's kind of shot and lit and the black and white is really, I think it's kind of beautiful in a weird way as well, isn't it? Yeah, it's great. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me once again. This has been so much fun. If people want to come and find you, Rosie, on social media and that kind of thing, where can they find you?
So you can find me on I'm at Rosarella Fletch is my Twitter handle. I'm also I'm the UK editor at Den of Geek, so if you want to come and read some stories about horror films on Den of Geek, then you'll certainly find some.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
No worries at all. Thanks.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my two special guests for this week, actress Lynn Lowry, so grateful for her time, and of course the brilliant Rosie Fletcher. Always such a treat to have her on the podcast. So, what do you think of David Cronenberg as a director in general? Do you have a particular favourite David Cronenberg film? And what do you think of these first two movies he made, Shivers and Rabid? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter and on Instagram, and you can also follow us on Letterboxd, and that's where you can keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering this series, so you can watch the movies in advance and keep up to date. And don't forget, you can still find every single episode of The Evolution of Horror, including a 14-part series on the slashers, a 20-episode series on ghost movies, and a 17-part series on folk horror. All of these can be found on evolutionofhorror.com, as well as a whole load of bonus content and some brilliant written articles in the blog section. That's evolutionofhorror.com. Don't forget, you can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Libsyn, various others. And if you get a chance, please do drop us a little rating or review. Ideally, a 5-star one would be nice. I mean, last week we got a 1-star review from somebody who thought that we were a little bit too left-wing and too communist. I'd rather ideally a slightly more positive review than that, if you can manage it. But seriously, if you can spare the time to write us a little review or just rate the podcast on iTunes, it really helps the podcast get bumped up in the charts and all of that kind of thing, which helps us get discovered by new listeners. Anyway, onwards and upwards. What have we got next for you? Well, next week we return to the next movie by George Romero, and we enter a dawn, no pun intended, of a brand new type of zombie movie. Next week I am going to be joined by horror film producer Jen Handorf to discuss one of the most iconic zombie movies ever made, Dawn of the Dead from 1978. Join us then for all of this and more on The Evolution of Horror.